Welcome back again this week. The next couple of episodes are going to be a bit bizarre and, for many people, very difficult to believe. As we have said, there have been many books written placing blame on one thing or another as the cause of the Civil War. We recall reading in the late 1980s, as part of researching our book in the Hayes, Kansas Public Library, a very old book written shortly after or near the end of the Civil War. It was written by a pastor who said it was God's punishment on the United States for deviating from God's Word, that is, the Civil War. Without understanding where he was coming from, one would think he was a tent revivalist who had a tendency to exaggerate. The problem today is that most Americans have no idea of the rise of the anti-Christian and anti-God movement that existed since the beginning of our country. We mentioned that Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin brought back from Europe a decidedly anti-Christian movement that set in motion the Spiritualist movement and is seldom mentioned in our history books. Domestically, the steady growth in the number of domestic and foreign radicals that promoted the Illuminati agenda has gone on unabated since the birth of our nation. Several American political parties have come and gone as a result. Due to the anti-Christian agenda as one of the main thrusts of this radicalism, transcendentalism, deism, and spiritualism came on the scene decades before the Civil War and had a huge influence on the established Christian denominations. Spiritualism had grown so influential just before the war that there were religious leaders who blamed it for the war as they saw it from their angle, as the example we cited above shows. From their viewpoint, spiritualism played the major part in bringing about the war. You cannot blame them for thinking that way and the way they did, because spiritualism had a large open following prior to the war and only grew larger after the war. We have stated that we did not want to get into denominationalism and how some churches have succumbed to Illuminism, feeling that it was best left to the reader and viewer, once they understood the Illuminist agenda, to decide for themselves relative to any particular church. We will use only one example, as we do in the book, that the Unitarian Church in the beginning was not as radical as it became. And while it was only an example we shall use, it is by no means the only one. It was the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a Unitarian minister educated by Edward Everett, and Emerson's friends that changed the sacraments, boiled down the very essence of Christianity into something called God, but in the steam boiled off Christ, and became centers for the socialization of America. Most Christians today look upon this denomination as more of a community action organization than a church. It is not unusual for them to provide a platform for the communist agenda in their community. Emerson's poetry was well accepted by the American people during his lifetime as well as today. Who would not be stirred by his poem etched on the pedestal of the Minuteman statue at the Concord Bridge? As a result of this status and the promotion of his reputation by socialist leaders such as Horace Greeley and George Henry Evans, his organizing and other writings did great harm. There are historians who claim that Emerson was an anti-socialist. The reality was that he worked with them his entire life in organizations and causes in support of a variety of socialist initiatives. Emerson himself said, quote, "I honor the generous ideas of the socialists, the magnificence of their theories, and the enthusiasm with which they have been urged." Now, we see these things happening in regard to Emerson, and in addition, Emerson lauded the key Carbonari and Marxist revolutionaries of the day. Indeed, Emerson's experience in Europe during the 1848 revolutions moved him into the role of a radical revolutionary in the pre-Civil War decade. Emerson was an important leader in the agenda against God, and this was the man we were required to read and look up to in our English classes when I went to school. The blatant attacks against God were not as successful as the more subtle, but the blatant attacks served to make the subtle seem moderate and reasonable. It was the technique of patient gradualism, steadily eroding the organized Christian faith. Religious leaders who were part of the conspiracy promoted the idea that Christianity was socialism, that to be a good Christian, you had to be a socialist. Now, John Humphrey Noyes, first cousin of President Rutherford Hayes, was a believer in spiritualism, or belief in communication with the spirit world. And Noyes said this belief was essential to the religious liberty of community. Noyes founded the communist commune called Oneida, and Noyes called, quote, the communication with the heavens the palladium of conservatism in the introduction of the new social order. When Noyes was first ordained as a minister, he climbed into the pulpit and claimed, "I am perfect." The church expelled him at the age of 23, as you could well imagine. Noyes called his movement perfectionism. It was by no means confined to a small commune. For instance, Garrison, the abolitionist leader, was an ardent member of this group. By 1861, they were calling their system communism. Charles Guiteau, who assassinated President Garfield, was also part of this group. As we said, the anti-Christian movement moved down two roads: the total rejection of religion, in other words, the radical, and two, the more subtle method of moving people a step at a time towards total rejection, or the moderate. They were both scheduled to arrive at the same destination, just by different routes. You take the high road and I'll take the low road. Without exposing the agenda, but having it as a natural byproduct of their design, was the subtle rejection that, as our Declaration of Independence proclaims, our rights come from God. By rejecting God and thereby the source of our rights, the state is substituted in His place, and thus our rights are granted by the state, as in all countries around the globe at the time, where government, usually through a king with divine right, grants the people's rights or takes them away. It is so important that this founding principle of God-given rights be understood, or we will lose our freedom. The attack on God is in reality an attack on American liberty. We have included only a couple of examples of pre-war spiritualism, the attack on God and the purpose of this agenda. We will begin to really show its influence next week. The names will surprise you.